tend to have more access to resources to be able to use in their defense versus people that don't have money. So you see a lot of, lower, and that's really a class issue, and race does come into play.
This is Let Your Voice Be Heard, right here on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. Good morning and welcome to Let Your Voice Be Heard right here on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. Happy Sunday, guys.
Happy Sunday.
Happy Sunday.
Yeah, so this is the show where we talk politics, foreign policy, and social justice from a diverse millennial perspective. We have a great show lined up. We're going to start off with introductions. My name is Selena Hill, and if you're wondering why I'm sitting in the engineer seat, it's because
I was wondering. I was like,
Stanley's
what?
Stanley apparently is...
He's on vacation. He's in Barbados with Rihanna.
Right.
This is what we always say about you
workcation.
whenever you're not here, Selena.
He's on a workcation in, I think, Albany. Where's he? Yeah, he's on workcation.
Sounds really luxurious, yeah.
Yeah, so he's living it up.
That's just where I want to go on vacation.
Yeah, it's Albany, New York. I was actually, that's why I missed the last show, because I was in Albany. So that's,
Really?
yeah, I was visiting friends in Albany.
Is that the new hotspot?
It's not. It's very cold. It is extremely cold. But, work brings me and Stanley there often, and we have some good friends that live there. So we're up there quite a bit.
Right. All right, guys.
Luckily, independently of each other. He's never there when I am, thank God.
Aw. All right, so yeah, my name is Selena Hill, and on Instagram and Twitter, you can follow me at Miss Selena Hill. You should definitely follow me on Instagram. I just did a rapid fire interview with Jim Jones.
You've been doing amazing interviews with what's his name from Scrubs?
Yes, Donald
Faison, which was so cute
Yeah,
and great. Yeah, your Instagram is everything.
Let me just tell you, we got a lot of negative feedback on that interview because a lot of people thought Jim may have been under the influence.
Well, he wasn't looking at you at all. He was like, it almost looked like he was annoyed to be asked questions, and you were doing a great job, and you were super sweet and personable, and he was like, whatever.
I know, right?
But he begrudgingly answered that. I would highly suggest people check it out.
It's pretty funny.
Shout out to Stanley who's watching us on live.
Shout
Shout
out to Stanley. Leave a comment, seriously. Alyssa.
Hi, good morning.
Did I take you off guard?
No, I drank lots of mimosas yesterday at a bridal shower.
Oh, that's fun.
I like bridal showers better than baby showers because, at a bridal shower, when the person opens gifts, I'm like, ooh, I would like that for my house, too. I'm like, ooh, I like that serving
it's
platter.
It's not like tiny little clothes and diapers and stuff. Yeah,
I mean, when I go to a baby shower, I'm like, can we please not play baby shower bingo because I think I'm going to kill myself.
Yeah, right.
I love baby shower bingo.
Of course
I usually
you do.
win the prizes, too.
She wants to
I bet you do.
She loves baby shower bingo. She doesn't want to know how the baby got there.
Right.
But she loves it
I
once
looked
the
it up
baby
on
is
Wikipedia
there.
one time.
Oh, no.
She had to read the Birds and the Bees book. What was that? There was a book like that.
I actually did get books like that.
But anyways, I'm Alyssa. I am not your Birds and Bees coordinator. I am your legal correspondent. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/Ilyssa Fuchs. That's Alyssa with an I. If you're fancy, and Ilyssa Fuchs on Twitter, where I get trolled by my losers and haters, as the president would say, because they don't like that I don't like Roy Moore, because apparently it's very popular to support alleged child molesters these days.
It is very popular for in
But
Alabama.
you can also leave a comment on Politically Preposterous, the fan page, and then, Jaqi can jump in and tell us how unpopular it is, or popular, I guess, to support alleged child molesters.
God, not in my book, but, apparently in the South, it's okay to support these men, specifically in Alabama. Anyway, I'm Jaqi Cohen. You can follow me on Twitter at Jaqi Cohen. That's JAQICOHEN. And I had a fun weekend. I was avoiding SantaCon at all costs yesterday. So I went to the one place I knew would be safe, which was the Jewish Museum on the Upper East Side. And it was great. Good. It was really nice. It was a safe haven among, from the Santas, the drunken Santas. So it was really nice.
I saw you post that on social media. And you're like, I'm so far from SantaCon.
I am as far as you can be. And then I came home and my boyfriend and I watched The Room in preparation for the Disaster Artist, which I'm very excited to see, hopefully soon.
So, yeah, James Franco was actually on Saturday Night Live last night. But anyways, when I got to Grand Central yesterday morning I had to go upstate to Poughkeepsie for this bridal shower. And I get there and it's like 10:15 in the morning. And there are people that are going to SantaCon and they're legit wasted. I mean, there were some people that were having a few drinks, which I get, you're going to SantaCon, maybe you have a mimosa or two. No, like there was these group of people and they were like dragging this girl because she was so wasted already. She couldn't even stand. And it was like 10:15 in the morning.
Well,
so,
I will say something that I appreciated that I
drinking.
saw this year that I don't know that I've seen as much of in years past. And I think it has to do with the spirit of 2017 going into 2018, like resisting. Was all these businesses that had signs on their door that was like, no Santas here, which, as like a Jewish kid from New York that has always had to, suffer through Christmas season without getting to participate, it was kind of funny to me.
Speaking of you being Jewish, we actually have a great show lined up.
Incredible segue.
Right, we're going to start the show speaking about Donald Trump's declaration that of Jerusalem being the capital of Israel, what this means, what it entails, the implications, and if it is basically a declaration of war against the Palestinians. So we're going to be delving right into Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So definitely you guys want to tune in and chime into that later on in the show. We'll be speaking about Pearl Harbor and how some of that history and lessons learned from the attack on Pearl Harbor still apply today, especially when it comes to like the rise of white nationalism and some other things. And then lastly, Ilyssa is going to give us a breakdown on why SCOTUS may very well decide to bust all public unions. I mean, we've been seeing this happen for the last few decades, and it looks like the Supreme Court may get that final say on that.
Well, it's interesting because it's actually the third time that the Supreme Court is hearing a kind of case like this. And the reason why they are hearing this case, or a very similar case to one they last heard again, is because Justice Scalia died and they never could come to a decision the last time they heard a case because they were deadlocked 4-4. And I'm going to get more into that later on, but that is very, very concerning because now we know who the justice is who has filled Justice Scalia's seat, and it is not somebody who's likely to vote in favor of unions.
Absolutely. So thank you, Ilyssa. We're looking forward to that full quickie. And of course, guys, if you want to let your voice be heard, feel free to leave us comments on our Facebook Live. Shout out to Gregory and Stanley, who's not here, but whatever. And you can also call us up at 212-650-6903. Right now, we're going to skywalk on our haters real quick, but we'll be right back on Let Your Voice Be Heard.
Celebrate every day like a birthday.
And we are back. This is Let Your Voice Be Heard right here on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. And I just wanted you guys to know if I ever mispronounce Arab, it's because of that song right there. Okay, it's Arab Money.
Check your pronunciation.
Busta Rhymes, guys. All right, so we're back. This is Let Your Voice Be Heard. My name is Selena Hill, filling in for Stanley Fritz, who is watching us via Facebook Live and being a loser. Ilyssa Fuchs is here, as well as Jaqi Cohen, and we're in for a special treat. Why? Because Jackie's here. And she can actually pronounce Arab correctly all the time.
You did
it.
Yeah, good job.
And thank you. And she's actually going to be introducing the next segment.
Yeah.
So Jackie's kicking off the show with the conversation about Jerusalem.
So in this segment, in this week, in What the Hell Are You Doing, Donald Trump, Trump made a decision. He issued a statement recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So earlier this week, he issued the statement saying that this is a good deal for both Israelis and Palestinians. He's very interested in deals and making good deals. And expressed his desire to move the United States Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And while he signed a 6-month waiver waiving the right to move the embassy forward, which every president has done since Jerusalem's, I think they added that law where you have to sign the waiver in the 90s. But, I mean, this is a step in a direction that no president since 1948 has taken. So even though the embassy is not moving, Donald Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital has had reverberations felt across the world. Many world leaders, including many of our allies in the United States, to the United States, have come out against this decision. And many people within Trump's own administration, including Rex Tillerson, John Mattis, have opposed this decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and to move the embassy there. So, I am hesitant to get into the history of why this situation is so fraught because there's so much there. I think most people are aware that there is a divide between Israelis and Palestinians and that much of that divide comes to a head in Jerusalem. Both Israelis and Palestinians view this land as theirs, and for decades, the U.S. has at least appeared to or tried to appear to be neutral in the situation. But this land is extremely important to both Israelis and Palestinians. It's split between East and West. Both Israelis and Palestinians view this land for political reasons and for religious reasons, and historical reasons, to be theirs, to be important. And so this is a very controversial decision. I want to open it up to you guys. What were your initial thoughts when you heard about this decision? Was it something that you thought immediately was really good, really bad? Did you think that there was any impact on the United States, or this is just like a foreign policy that has nothing to do with us?
Yeah, I mean, it was extremely controversial. It caused massive outrage in the international community, especially amongst Palestinians and Arabs. I was shocked, but then again, I wasn't, because this is one of the promises that Donald Trump campaigned on. He said, he was very forefront about being very pro-Israel. And he said, we need to move our embassy to Jerusalem and we need to support Israel. So it's you can't really expect it. But the thing is, I'm with all of the controversy and conflict that this president has buzzing around him and his administration, it's just you would think one day he would just wake up and say, I'm going to do something that's actually going to heal and bring our country together. I'm not going to try to. I'm not going to continue to pander to my base, which happens to be conservative, right-leaning evangelicals, and other Republican and conservatives, but I'm going to do something that would better the nation. But no, he didn't. He made a decision that I think is very unstrategic, because I don't even understand why he made this declaration without getting anything in return.
Largely symbolic.
Yeah, right. And I think that it's just, I feel like he's still trying to campaign and rally up his base.
Well, he's done such a great job dividing our country that he needs to go to the most divisive place on earth, which is Israel-Palestine, and put an even bigger wedge between the two sides there. But Ilyssa?
Right. Yeah. I mean, listen, to me, it just didn't seem to make any sense, because other than being symbolic, as I pointed out, there's really not any actual changes that is happening. So it's to me, it's throwing fuel on a fire for no good reason whatsoever in order to appease a small group of your base, be it, evangelicals and right-wing Jews who have been asking for this thing. I mean, at the end of the day, he still signed the waiver to keep the embassy in Tel Aviv.
Right.
And more importantly, this jettisons the peace talks, because if you really wanted to have peace in the Middle East, this is a decision that is going to make the PLO and make Hamas step away from the table and be like, well, why should we negotiate with you when you smacked us in the face? That's what big reason why everybody was telling him not to do it. And another more important piece of that is the U.S. is supposed to be a non-biased negotiator in the peace deal. Well, if you
an honest broker,
right, an honest broker. If you are making this decision, then you are essentially saying we are putting our thumbs on the scales for the Israeli people. And so that is going to make it that you are no longer a neutral arbiter and should not be involved in the peace process whatsoever.
Well, I think some would argue that the U.S. has already put their thumbs on the scales,
Absolutely.
Right? And that this is just a more transparent way of saying, well, we support Israel and not Palestine, and that is the U.S. Policy, right? But this is clearly a more overt way of doing so, and has the ability to cause a lot of problems in Israel-Palestine. I think a lot of people are worried that there's going to be violence that results from this. There have already been some more violent protests, I believe, in Lebanon.
This morning.
Yeah, this morning. So this is something, and a president, as the president, as someone who was so critical of what happened in Benghazi and was so critical of Obama's administration, is putting his own ambassadors at risk of violence, right?
Yeah, and the other thing is, he didn't get anything in return.
Right.
You know, they could have, in some ways, I mean, and you can disagree, but like, it's like he could have said, all right, Bibi Netanyahu, he's the prime minister of Israel. He could have said, listen, we'll move the embassy and we'll announce that Jerusalem is going to be recognized by America's capital. In exchange, you have to stop building settlements in the West Bank right now.
Right.
And because if you continue to build the settlements, it's going to make it much, much harder for us to have peace. And so he could have extracted a concession. To me, it seems like this was just sort of a giveaway. And, you know, we didn't really get anything in return. And that just doesn't seem like a good strategy from a negotiating point of view either.
Right, exactly. So scaling it back a little bit and talking about who in the United States supports this decision versus who is against it. I think in large part it's conservative Jews. It is Christians, evangelical Christians, many Republicans support this move. On the opposite side of things, Reform Jews such as myself are opponents of this deal. But I want to ask, why do you think now? Do you think that he's just like, I'm going to solve the crisis in the Middle East? Like, I'm going to make peace in Palestine and Israel. That is my plan. Like, why do you think now he's going forth with this decision?
I mean, honestly, and I would just have to repeat what I said earlier. I think that he's just really just trying to rally up his base and trying to score cool points with his supporters, which happen to be evangelical Christians and also right-wing Jews and AIPAC. So, I mean, unless he has, owe somebody some money, I don't know why.
Right.
I mean, I have a theory, and it's called a distraction, which is Trump needs any distractions that he can get because of what's going on here with his own scandal and with Robert Mueller's investigation. And I don't want to sidetrack this conversation because it's not about that. But when you have this major thing going on and, all these people in your campaign are getting indicted and you don't want people to be talking about that, then you give them something else to talk about.
Right.
And he knew that this was such a politically charged decision that everybody was going to be talking about that. Okay, so now they're talking about this and they're no longer, some of us are still talking about Russia, but at least for the moment, it deflects, the attention onto a different issue.
Yeah, but it's just still negative attention. But I just wanted to add on to the comment I made about evangelical Christians. They have, since the 1980s, we've seen them rise as a political force. And I think that also is a big factor into why he's pandering to this base.
Well, who's up for election this Tuesday, but Roy Moore, who's much of his base is made up of evangelical Christians. So I wonder if that has something to do with it. I mean, it sounds outrageous, but I wouldn't put it past this president to make a decision like this in support of Roy Moore, to get people out and excited to vote and, dog whistle to this evangelical right-wing base. I mean, I think that could be a large part of it. I don't think it's that outrageous knowing this president and how he operates that he would play so fast and loose with the conflict in the Middle East just to get votes for someone like Roy Moore.
I mean, but he would.
He would.
That's the type of person that he is.
He absolutely would.
Absolutely. And I just want to throw the phone number out there, guys.
Please.
If you are listening and you want to chime in, feel free to give us a call at 212-650-6903. And we've been seeing Donald Trump go extra hard in supporting and rallying up for Roy Moore over this past weekend. So, yeah, I wouldn't put it past him.
And the other thing is that the majority of Israeli Jews don't support this move. So I was reading an article yesterday that said something like 80% of the people living in Israel that recognize or that are Israeli Jews do not support this because they also think for one of two reasons. Either A, they fall on the left, and they're against their own government's occupation of certain, and the building of settlements, just like, Jews like myself and Jaqi are. They obviously recognize that Israel has a right to exist and that it should be a Jewish state, but they also feel that it's not right for Israelis who came from Jews that left the, Eastern Europe after the Holocaust in order to escape oppression and a genocide to then be perpetuating that kind of oppression on other people.
Right.
From the right, there are Israeli Jews that disagree with this because what they say is this makes it more likely that there's not going to be a two-state solution, that there will be instead a one-state solution. And what's going to happen if there's a one-state solution is either A, you have to only give Arab Israelis limited rights, especially in terms of the right to vote, or B, if you give them full rights, then there's a good possibility that Arab Israelis will start to become, at least equal in the Knesset, which is their legislature, or the majority, at which point the right-wing Israelis will say, well, then it's no longer a Jewish state.
Right.
Because, the whole idea was that their whole parliament is made up only of Israeli Jews, although now there's some Israeli Arab Jews, because obviously there's been race mixing going on in Israel the same way there's race mixing here. So,
and I would also add that I think a lot of Israelis are against this simply because of the threat of violence that it poses, that this can result in a really violent uprising out of anger for this decision. And I think that's something that, Trump wants. I could see him wanting violence to erupt from the situation. I mean, keep in mind that right now he's fighting for a Muslim ban in this country. And I think that he can drum up a violent situation in Israel and then go to Americans and say, hey, look at how violent these Muslims are being. We need a Muslim ban. This is something, he's using this, I think, as a way to politicize issues domestically. I don't really think that he cares too much about foreign policy. I think he cares about winning elections and creating more domestic support. And so between, issuing support for Roy Moore through this decision and creating more support for his Muslim ban, I think that, those are the things that he's focusing on.
Absolutely. Selena?
Yes, thank you. We actually have a caller who would like to leave a comment, a very special caller by the name of Stanley Fritz. Are you there?
Good.
Hey, guys, I'm here.
Hello.
Hey, Stanley. So you listening?
Yes, I am.
What do you think?
So I heard Ilyssa and Jaqi talking about a lot of Israeli people are against this move to make Jerusalem the capital. And, I have a hard time believing that Israeli citizens are against this or want a two-state solution because they keep supporting Netanyahu. And he feels empowered enough to do this, and it's not just because a handful of people want this. He has to have some kind of mandate or majority.
Stanley, stay on the line. Jaqi has a direct response.
I mean, I would argue that it's as true, Israeli citizens want Netanyahu as much as Americans want Trump. There are ways to manipulate elections where the extremists get out and vote for him. And I think that's become increasingly more true. I don't think that, I think there are a lot of moderate and liberal Israelis that do not support Netanyahu and do not support this decision. So, I get what you're saying, that politically it would seem as though this is something that Israelis are all unanimously for, but I think that they are as diverse in their political opinions as we are.
Right. No, I would agree with that. I would also add that, we have to recognize that Israel does not have the same type of government that we have. It's coalition governing. They don't use the type of electoral system we use, and that so it's an interesting thing where even people within the coalition of governing or Bibi Netanyahu's coalition of governing don't necessarily share his views, but they have formed this coalition government because of the manner in which the unicameral system is set up there.
Stanley?
Yeah, and I appreciate that information, but the fact still remains, whether there was a Netanyahu or not, the people that suffer the most from this are Palestinians all the time. And Netanyahu, who's winning on these settlements that he's doing without anyone's permission, and now he's got the capital, and then now a whole bunch of Palestinian people are probably going to suffer even more because he's going to use a heavy hand with the military. So, if people care, they're not caring hard enough because a lot of Palestinian people are suffering.
Yeah, Stanley, I think that you make an excellent point there. Yeah. Thank you so much for calling in. If you have another question or comment, you can call back. And guys, if you are listening and want to leave or want to share your thoughts on this, feel free to call us up at 212-650-6903. Jaqi?
Well, I think Ilyssa had a quick point.
Yeah, no, what I was going to say is today's actually the 70th anniversary of the UN's Declaration on Human Rights. And I think it's interesting because it sort of ties into what Stanley was just saying, that the Palestinian people are the people that are really suffering in this. And that's true. I think of a lot of American Jews in some ways don't realize just how politically fraught the situation is. In some ways, they either haven't been to Israel, which I have, they haven't gone to the West Bank, which I have, and they don't realize the way in which the Israeli government is treating the Palestinian people and oppressing them. And I think if some of the American Jews here, whether they're on the left or the right, realize just how much this is connected back to our own struggle as Jews, and that's why I bring up the UN Declaration on Human Rights, because that was created in 1948 after the Holocaust, when Jewish people sort of were making their pilgrimage back to the land that they call Judea, which, as an aside, is part of the reason why there's so much conflict over this land to begin with, is that all three major religious groups claim that their religions were started in this place. That's another show. We could, spend hours talking about that. But, I think it's really important for American Jews to realize just what's going on there, and to realize that, it's not okay to oppress people because we were oppressed peoples, and we're we have to perpetuate, going forward to make sure we're not oppressing other peoples and not do the same thing that was done to us, because it's wrong.
I think we're going to get into that when we come back from break.
Stay tuned, guys. This is Let Your Voice Be Heard. And we are back. This is Let Your Voice Be Heard right here on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. Just coming back from break, we're talking about Trump's declaration that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, and the implications and outrage that this has caused across the world. And even like American Jews, a lot of, people who just don't lean right and aren't radical are saying this is a horrible decision. And, Jackie, I'll just throw it back to you.
Yeah, but many people are saying that this is a good decision, right? Many Americans are in support or supportive, including Chuck Schumer, New York U.S. Senator, right? So why do you think some people are so vehement about supporting this decision, even people that typically go up against Trump?
I would have to say, and for what I would think, it would have to be something that stemmed deeply into Islamophobia. I think that that's just been a trend for going on 2 decades, especially after 9/11, where you have people who are less sympathetic to Palestinian oppression, and they more so feel like, they look at the Muslim community as violent, as terrorists, and we see this perpetuated continually in right-wing media and even from our president. So it's like, if you think these people are terrorists, then you're not really gonna side with them. And I also wanted to just bring up that the way Palestinians and Arabs feel is horrible, right? We couldn't get a Palestinian voice here, but from their perspective, I can only imagine what this must mean, because we've seen so many administrations support Israeli oppression and occupation of Palestinians. And I heard one activist say, I'm not even surprised, because the United States is a colonizer. So it only makes sense that they would support the colonization of another dominant country into a people who do not have as many resources. So,
it seems to be in line
and
with
it's a drop in the bucket.
Yeah.
It's a drop in the bucket.
That's what some people are saying. Alyssa?
Yeah, listen, I think sort of from there's my perspective, and then there's the perspective of American Jews that support this decision. My perspective, as I've said, is I do not support this decision as an American Jew. I've said earlier in the segment, I absolutely support Israel, and I support Israel's right to exist. At the same time, I do not support Israel's right to oppress. I do think there needs to be a solution where Palestinians are given their own state and the full rights of a sovereign state. That said, the way American Jews look at this is that, really one of two ways. Either A, this is our land, period. Palestinians have no right to it whatsoever, which is ahistorical and not historically accurate at all. Or B, there is this perception that sort of comes from a racist place, or a place of fear, where American Jews believe that there are Arabs and Muslims that call for death to Israel. They don't think Israel has the right to exist. They think all Jews should be killed. There's and they say, why should we play into the hands of these terrorists? They think that that Hamas, which does have terrorist ties, or at least part of it does, is just completely a terrorist group, that all these people are terrorists, that they're backwards people, that they should, not be allowed to have a say in a Jewish state, which, side note, if they had their own state, then, which that's sort of a big sticking point is East Jerusalem. Even if you were able to find a way to divide the West Bank out from Israel and say that we were going going to give Arabs a sovereign state. There would
Right.
still be this sticking point over who gets to control East Jerusalem. But at the end of the day, so the way these Jews look at it, these right-wing Jews here in America, is that, if you give somebody an inch, they're going to take a mile. And so if they give Palestinians inch, then they're going to take a mile and they're going to continue to attack Israel. And eventually, there will be no Israeli state, or they will try and destroy Israel because, there are a small group. We have to acknowledge there are a small group of people that do think that Israel shouldn't exist. But they blow it up to make it seem like that's everybody.
Right.
And so that's where I think this is coming from for them. So they're like, you know what, this is our land. We have the right to it. We don't think they should have any right to
Right.
it. And we want the president to recognize Jerusalem as the capital because that's where the Knesset is. That's where the seat of government is. And, so there's no reason why the United States shouldn't recognize that.
Right. I mean, I will speak from my own experience as a Jew growing up in America, growing up in a Reformed synagogue, which, was where I did learn about Israel and not about the occupation. I'm sure there are as many types of Jews as there are Jews, or as many ways of being Jewish as there are Jews, right? So I'm not going to speak for everybody's experience, but certainly my own. And I think that a lot of people have a similar shared experience to mine, was that I was taught in my religious upbringing, and I went to Hebrew school for many, many years, was that, Israel belonged to Jews and that Palestinians believed that Jews had no right to exist. Not even that Israelis had no right to exist, but that Jews had no right to exist. And they wanted to, wipe Jews off the face of the earth. This is what I was taught growing up, right? This is what was put forth to me. And it wasn't until I was an adult and I met Palestinians who were like, no, that's not how we roll. We want our own right to exist. We want to not be occupied. We want the right to return to our own land. You get to go on a free birthright trip. It's called your birthright as a Jew to return home to our home and, experience Israel in its entirety and have this great 10-day trip. And we can't even go home and visit our families because they've been displaced, right? And so it wasn't until much later that I sort of had to unwire my brain and relearn what was really happening. But it was a very effective strategy to get me as an American Jew to really just side with Israel without questioning, because it seemed complicated. It seemed like, okay, there's two clear sides, the side that wants me to exist and the side that doesn't. And I'm just going to support Israel without questioning it. And that's a problem. And I think that there are a lot of Jews, especially left-leaning Jews, right? Especially Jews that vote Democratic, that support progressive causes, that are consider themselves progressives and truly are on most issues, except when it comes to Israel, because it's uncomfortable, because Jews have this experience of trauma, right, through the Holocaust, through pogroms that led their families here. They carry this weight of, okay, we survived this thing that many didn't, and so we need to carry on our own legacy. So there's a lot of weight that Jews carry there, but they're using that as justification to oppress another group of people, and that cannot persist. And when we close our eyes to what's happening and, ignore it and pretend that this is something that's happening in another part of the world that has nothing to do with us as American Jews, that is dangerous because it allows our government to make decisions using our name and on our behalf that we do not consent to.
Right. Absolutely. Listen, just to add on to that, which is, I think also, I agree. I was taught the same thing, and I think a lot of other American Jews are also. But to add on to that, I also think part of it is sort of an ignorance on the behalf of American Jews that don't actually realize what the situation is in the West Bank at all. They don't realize that Israelis can come and go freely, and yet there's checkpoints that, tell Palestinians when they can come in, when they can go out. There's constant security. There's people spying on each other all the time and reporting things back to the Israeli government, even when things are not going on. People feel like they can't speak freely about political issues that, are important. There is a total control. There are literally lockdown neighborhoods where Israelis are building settlements at the direction of Bibi Netanyahu in places that were not considered theirs. And what they're finding is that once those lands become occupied by Israelis, they largely will not go back to being Palestinian controlled. And so I think if more American Jews who have said in their own lives, never again will we let somebody like Hitler come to power and put Jews in ghettos and put Jews in concentration camps, and they just don't realize how bad things are. Now, that's not to say that things are as bad as they were in Poland during the 1940s. They are not in some ways, and in some ways
Some
they
might
are.
argue that they are.
Exactly. that's what I said. In some ways they are, in some ways they aren't. But it's not just a matter of the brainwashing. It's also a matter of being brainwashed and then refusing to open your eyes to what's going on. And just to plug, I hate to plug this show now, given the sort of situation going on with like the sexual harassment type stuff, but the last season of Transparent, they go to Israel and they really address this. And there's an episode where one of the characters, who's an American Jew, goes to Ramallah and goes and sees really what's going on and how the Palestinian people are being treated. And yes, this is a fictional TV show, but they do a really good job of being accurate about the situation that's going on there. And if you haven't seen it, or if you don't know what's going on, but you want to like learn about it more in a way that you can watch sort of a fictional American TV show, I would recommend watching the past season of Transparent, not for the LGBTQ issues, but to learn more about the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Selena?
Yeah, so, all that being said, I think it's important to discuss why it matters for the U.S. to take a side, and if it even does matter. Because, I understand, on the surface, the U.S. was supposed to display some type of neutrality and be that negotiator between both sides.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why no other president made such a declaration like this. And Trump is what Trump did is seen as so radical. But on the other side, the flip side of things, under the Obama administration, the U.S. gave the Israeli military $38 million. So it seems like there's almost like this facade where the U.S. was appearing to be very neutral and trying to bring together both sides. But and it seems like Trump disrupted that. But did he just simply say what he called was a reality and just say, instead of trying to play both sides, I'm going to keep it real. And this is the side that we've always been on.
Right. I mean, I brought that up at the beginning of the segment. I think that's a great point, is that the U.S., while attempting to be or, claiming to be this quote unquote honest broker, really hasn't been, just two-sided in this. They've definitely taken the side of supporting Israel and, funding the Israeli military, certainly. And so I think that's a great point. Is it just Trump pulling the wool off of everybody's eyes and saying, well, this is what we've already been doing, so I'm just going to go ahead? Or, is it more than that?
I mean, it sounds like the question about whether or not you would rather somebody be racist to your face than, be racist, in sort of an underground way where you're not really sure whether it's racism or not. In some ways, I sort of agree with that, but I also sort of feel like Trump is doing this because this is a Trump thing to do, which is anytime somebody tells Donald Trump, don't do X because it's not a good idea to do X, Donald Trump hears that as, I should definitely do X.
Yeah,
so,
right.
That sort of also comes from his political inexperience. Jared Kushner's over there trying to work out a peace deal. Everybody's telling him, don't do this because we're sort of maybe not getting where we want to get that fast, but we're sort of starting to have some legitimate talks about how we might be able to solve this issue. And then all of a sudden, Donald's like, well, I think I have this great idea. I'm going to do this.
I got a deal that I'm going to put in place. Right.
And then, as I said, circling back, he doesn't get anything for it. So, that's the most perplexing thing about the whole thing.
Selena?
Well, the thing is, what are some of the long-term implications? What is this going to lead to? And I've heard some Palestinians say this was a declaration of war against Palestine. And then I've heard other people say that's hyperbolic. Yeah. So what do you think?
I think it's entirely possible that this could lead to war. I mean, especially if the embassy moves, right? So in 6 months, every 6 months, the United States president has to sign a waiver deciding whether or not to keep the U.S. embassy in Israel in Tel Aviv or to move it elsewhere to Jerusalem. So, maybe in 6 months, the president decides that it's time to move the embassy and that he really wants to go full steam ahead with this plan. I think that could definitely trigger a war. I mean, that's how fraught the situation is.
I mean, there was practically a war almost popped off a year and a half ago over nothing, right? There was no real impetus for it whatsoever. And then all of a sudden people started firing rockets and then people started firing rockets back. And then there was this couple week period where things were sort of really, really tense and we didn't know if a whole war was going to break out. And there was no politically fraught decision at that point in time. So, this is in some ways a powder keg, and we have to handle it with kid gloves. And Donald Trump has kid hands, but he doesn't know how to handle anything with kid gloves.
Yeah, right.
You know, he's
lost his gloves.
He's like the guy that shows up to the Lego castle and is like, let me smash the Lego castle as good as I can, and see what happens next.
He has no intent of ever being diplomatic in anything. Well, at least that's what the past and his history has shown us. But, you know, I kind of wanted to talk about, like, you know, moving forward now, and I understand that it was reported on the news this morning that one of the tunnels that Hamas was using was, like, blown up or destroyed. And the thing is, like, I understand how and why it's a threat and it's a danger to, like, Israelis and to the society there in whole. But then again, I feel like Palestinians feel like they're naked and extremely vulnerable. And if they don't have any defense system, they are going to not be in existence. And especially with the anti-Islamic sentiment coming from the West, whether that's America or France, you know, it's like they feel extremely vulnerable. And I think that's even why we have Hamas, because it's seen as if we don't fight back, we won't be here.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, right? There's this like chicken or the egg kind of situation. And, you know, I think talking to a lot of American Jews that support this decision, one thing that you hear time and time again is, well, they're violent. They don't want us to exist. Like, they're the violent ones. We're just protecting ourselves. But that's not true, right? That's not, you know, while there is, I can't even believe I'm about to say there's violence on both sides, but they're absolutely, to quote our president. But, you know, while it's true that there is violence on both sides, I mean, it's not, there's this perceived idea that Israel is just acting on the defensive and they're not aggressively taking over land and occupying territories and causing violence themselves. And I think that this comes with this fear of, if we're not on the offense, if we're not doing everything we can to hold on to this land, we'll be, you know, annihilated. And so there's this big misconception that it's just, you know, Israel sitting back and saying, no, hey, like, we're just protecting ourselves, when really I think that's happening in Palestine, you know, with Palestinians as well.
Yeah,
Ilyssa?
no, I mean, listen, I agree with all that. I don't really have much else to add. My final closing comments on this situation will be, are that, you know, if you're an American Jew, it is long past time for you to open your eyes to the complete situation. And, you know, I said this earlier, but I'm going to say it again because I think it's really important, which is, as Jews, we are taught, never again. Never let a genocide happen to our people again. Never let an oppression happen to our people again. And not just to our people, to everybody. That's the Martin Niemöller quote, right? You know, first they came for the socialists. I wasn't a socialist, so I didn't speak out. And then they came for this person and that person, and I said nothing. And then they came for me. When Jews do not speak out against this type of oppression because they are scared to wade into this conversation due to the fact it affects them directly or indirectly as a Jew, and, you know, the fact that the Israel is the, you know, quote unquote home and birthplace of the Jewish people, they are being the silent in the same way that people were silent during the 1940s when Jews were being exterminated, and that is not okay. So what I would say is, if you're an American Jew, we don't always have to agree. We can agree to disagree on certain issues, but I think, you know, it's not okay to put the wool over your eyes and pretend as though this stuff is not going on.
Yeah, Selena?
Yeah, no, those were great points. And I would just, like, I guess, ask the question of, like, will there ever be a two-state solution? Like, I mean, it took years to even get to, like, this point before Trump made that declaration, because I know that, like, there are some people advocating for Eastern Jerusalem to belong to the Palestinians and Western Jerusalem to belong to Israel. And it's like, you know, Jaqi, I know you're about to close, and maybe you can answer this question. Do you think that can happen?
I mean, not with Trump's direction, certainly not. But I think that, you know, in asking that question, can there be a one or two state solution, or, you know, what is going to result from this? I think to sort of echo what Ilyssa said, as American Jews, we play a tremendous role in upholding what is happening in Israel and the occupation of Palestinian territories. And I think it's not necessarily up to us to decide what is best for Israel-Palestine, but it is our responsibility as American Jews who are progressive, who are left-leaning, who, actively fight back against oppression, to take a good look at the ways that we are complicit in oppression, especially in Israel, the way that we fund and support and uphold oppression through the occupation, and, question ourselves. What are we doing? Are we ignoring this issue because it makes us uncomfortable, because we don't, we're afraid for ourselves? Like Ilyssa made that great point that never again, right? Never again. We say that when we talk about the Holocaust, when we talk about oppression of Jews, but because we were oppressed as Jews does not mean that we cannot actively be oppressors. And I think that it's important for us as an American community that has a huge role, as we've seen here. The actions of the American president are playing out and have tremendous reverberations across the world. So I think that as American Jews, it is our responsibility to take a good look at ourselves and the way that we are upholding what is happening in Israel-Palestine and, change the course of our direction.
Absolutely. And on that note, we do have to take another quick break, but don't go anywhere, guys. When we come back, we're jumping right into some of our favorite stories of the week, the ones we love, the ones we hated, and the ones about all of these Democratic politicians stepping down. So stay tuned. This is Let Your Voice Be Heard. And we are back. This is Let Your Voice Be Heard right here on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. Happy Sunday, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. Again, my name is Selena Hill. I'm here with Ilyssa Fuchs and Jaqi Cohen. We just wrapped up a great conversation about Israeli occupation in Palestine and how Trump just made everything worse and possibly leads to war.
Want to do.
I know. I mean, hey, this is a Trump world and everything gets worse, apparently. So now we're going to talk about some of our favorite news stories of the week, the ones we love, the ones we love to hate. And of course, guys, you can chime in. The number is 212-650-6903.
You should also tweet us at BeHeard_radio,
or you should leave a comment on our Facebook
Please,
Live
we'll read
feed. We will read it if it comes up in time. There's like a slight delay,
but post it.
But post it anyway.
All right, guys. So I'm a bit conflicted. Senator Al Franken and John Conyers stepped down over the past week because of allegations of sexual harassment. We know with John Conyers, who was one of the longest serving congressmen in the House of Representatives and the longest serving African American at that. He was one person who helped pass Martin Luther King Jr. as a federal holiday, and he did some other historic things in our country. But it turns out he settled sexual harassment suits back in 2015, and he used taxpayer money to do so. So that he stepped down, and then Senator Al Franken stepped down over that photograph where he was grabbing a woman's breast and some other.
Well, he was. It came out that he had
forcibly kissed.
Yeah.
Wait, wasn't Donald Trump accused of that this week too?
Wait, and every week and since weeks before the election.
I clearly remember Donald Trump saying, I use a Tic Tac. I just start kissing them, and then
let you just do it.
And then I just grab her.
I don't even ask.
I don't even ask.
Well, even though he admitted and apologized for that, lately he's actually been denying that that's his voice.
Billy Bush said it is his voice.
He's denied that that's his voice.
He was like, we don't think that's. He said we don't think it's my voice.
Excuse me.
But but here's the question that I have.
That's
because
hilarious.
Stats show that Republican voters are way more tolerant towards sexism and sexual harassment, meaning that's why Vermont
is this news?
Is winning in
Alabama.
But the thing is, I understand Democrats, we like to take the moral high ground, but now we're leaving Al Franken's seat up for grabs. And we see what's happening in Detroit. So the thing is, I'm all for it, but are we shooting ourselves in the foot in this process?
I don't know. I mean, I hear that a lot, but I also think, look at this past election and look at how many women, trans women, women of color were just elected. who were running for office for the first time. Like, I think that there's this like fatalistic view that's like, oh, because these men were taken down, who could possibly fill this role? And I'm like, a woman could fill this role, right? And
but will she be voted? Will a left-leaning politician fill this seat?
I think so. I mean, who knows, right? Like, it's
well,
scary,
Conyers
it's
endorsed
dangerous.
his son, so
Yeah.
And in Al Franken's seat, Donald
woman.
Trump won that state.
Right.
So they're Republican.
Right. I just wanted to correct something you said earlier about you said, Republicans don't seem to, be, care so much about the issue as like Democrats do and take the moral high ground. I think Republicans do care about it, but only when it's a Democrat because they're hypocrites. Whereas like Democrats feel like there's sort of this moral high ground that has to be taken regardless of whether it's somebody in their own party or
Right.
somebody in the opposite party. So it's just like that's the thing that bothers me most about it is that, I'm not saying that Democrats should do something differently. I think Democrats are doing the right thing, actually.
Yeah, me too.
I think it's frustrating to me that, when Bill Clinton, got a blowjob in the Oval Office, the Republicans like heads went on fire as if it was like the worst thing to ever happen to America. And now they're literally about to potentially elect an alleged likely possible child molester in Alabama because according to them it's better to vote for a Republican than a liberal, even if the Republican has been accused of touching 14-year-old girls.
Right, but I think that the conflict comes when I agree, obviously Democrats are holding themselves accountable for this kind of behavior, and we see that because Conyers and Al Franken are stepping down, but at the same time there's a debate. A lot of people on the left don't think they should step down, right, for the exact same reasons that they don't think that Roy Moore should step out of the election, right? Because they would rather have this Democrat in office than any Republican. And so, it's such a catch-22, right? You're damned if you do, damned if you don't, because
Right.
you're damned if you do, and then a Republican steps into that seat, but you're damned if you don't, because then you have somebody who has been accused of sexual harassment or abuse, remaining in power. And so it's not an easy conversation to have. Obviously, I agree with Ilyssa. I think the right thing is happening. I think these men should step down. But it's a difficult conversation. I don't think anybody's completely right or wrong.
Well, like you said, it's tough, and we're gonna have to see what happens with these empty seats, because if things shift more red and more right, then definitely we're gonna be screwed either way. Guys, be sure to tune in and chime in at 212-650-6903.
So this week in racism, Steve King, who is a representative from the 4th District of Iowa, said that diversity is not our strength. And then he quoted the Hungarian prime minister who said, quote, mixing cultures will not lead to a higher quality of life, but a lower one. And this is also the same week that I just want to remind you, in other news, Roy Moore, on top of being an alleged child molester, rapist, etc., and just all around bad person, Roy Moore also said this week that black families were better off during slavery.
Oh,
so, we have, this week in Republican racism, you guys want to react?
Was that a direct quote?
No, not a direct quote. I am paraphrasing. That was Sum and Substance. But essentially what he was talking about is like the family structure, and said that like black families stayed together better during slavery, which, by the way, is also completely historically inaccurate.
Yeah, I'm sure black families stayed together really well when they were ripped apart by their owners and, sold to other people. Like, that is,
It's preposterous.
I have no words.
Well, I'll say this. Studies actually show that the more diverse your company and business is, the better your bottom line. The reason being is because when you have a diverse group of people in a marketing room or, in a business meeting, number one, you're less likely to make marketing mistakes like that epic Pepsi ad, which appropriated Black Lives Matter images, and a number of other marketing failures, which we've seen from companies do. Because if you ask me, I just think they don't have enough black people to say, like, hey,
don't do that.
Like that Dove commercial where a black woman turned into a white woman. Like, you need somebody in there to say, hey, bad idea.
Just had one person in there that was like, you probably shouldn't. Just look at it again. Like, just,
And on top of that, when you have diversity of thought, it also shows that your business does better. So I think that these people need to come out of the racist thinking of the 1930s that they're in and just step into time. Because, I mean, like, you have companies and studies showing that it's just false. I mean, let alone inhumane.
Students do better in diverse classrooms, right?
Yeah.
When they're interacting with people with a diverse set of experiences from them. So, right, he's just wrong.
The more diversity that you're around, the less implicit bias you'll have, the more trusting and understanding you'll be as a person. Like, it betters you as an individual. So to think that somehow segregation is the best way of life, it's just not true. And like, that's that stupidity and ignorance that hurts that hurts us as a country.
I think you give them too much credit by calling it stupidity and ignorance. I think it's just straight up racism.
I think racism is embedded in stupidity and ignorance, because I think that if people understood how people work and understand that, like, just because you're black, you're not inferior to someone who's white, and you have that type of education, then you'll have a better understanding of the world. So it's in there as well.
No, I agree. I'm going to shift gears for a second. I want to talk about something that is, very local to here, but I know it's not just going on here. So there was a big protest this week in New York City.
There were many big protests this week.
I'm like, which one?
Okay, so there was many big protests, but I'm talking specifically about one, which is public defenders. Public defenders protested.
That was not the one I thought. Like, there were so many. I
too.
was rolling through like 5 or 6 of them. And that was not the one I thought you were going to. But that's great that there were so many this week.
So, yeah, and the reason why these public defenders were protesting is because ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, are showing up at courthouses, and they are snatching people from courthouses, to bring them to immigration detention. And what public defenders are saying is that this is creating a situation both in civil court and in criminal court where people aren't showing up to court because they're afraid that they may get snatched up by immigration. And so now you are creating a situation where, let's say somebody gets like, I don't know, some kind of minor summons for littering, and they have to go to criminal court to deal with it. And maybe it's even a bogus summons, and they were falsely given this summons, or maybe they actually were littering. But either way, when they don't show up to court because they're afraid that they might get picked up by ICE at the courthouse, they then end up having a warrant, and that makes them even more vulnerable and creates multiple issues. They're saying that victims are scared to go to court to report crimes because they're afraid that if they're undocumented and they're a victim of the crime and they have to go to court to testify against somebody or to meet with the DA's office, that they may be picked up. And also in terms of civil court, when people have a civil dispute, like with a landlord, where the landlord shuts their heat off and they would normally go to court and be like, you can't shut my heat off. People are not wanting to go to court because they're afraid that they're going to be picked up at court. And this isn't just happening here in New York City. This is happening all over the country. There's a big push to try and get the governor to tell, basically to sign a law that says that, federal agents, except under limited circumstances, are not allowed to just come into courthouses and apprehend people. And just like, this is wrong. If immigration is looking for somebody and they have legitimate documentation that says they can pick that person up, and, obviously we can have a longer conversation one day about immigration and, whether or not the Trump administration should be doing this. But then, that's fine. But they shouldn't be going to the courthouses to pick those people up. They need to find another way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's just so sad and disheartening how we fought so hard to get immigrant and undocumented workers out of the shadows, and how they're being forcibly pushed back into the shadows to the point where they won't even report domestic abuse or, any type of abuse or exploitation. They're just sitting there and taking it because they're scared that, hey, if I open my mouth, me or my family might get shipped back to a country that I've never known or haven't been there in 10 to 20 years.
I know. And I think that it's not only that people who are undocumented, I would presume, are afraid to report these crimes, but it makes them more of a target to predators who know that they won't likely report these crimes because of fear of, retaliation or fear of being deported. So it's a huge, huge issue.
No, absolutely. Yeah, guys, and I also wanted to bring up Donald Trump. So we know that he has waged an all-out war against the media, something that he calls fake news, despite the fact that he perpetuates fake news all the time.
Yeah. And he watches it.
So he's been going extra hard against CNN. Just in the past 24 hours, he said, and I quote his tweet, "CNN's slogan is CNN, the most trusted name in news. Everyone knows this is not true. This could in fact be a fraud on the American public. There are many outlets that are far more trusted than fake news CNN. Their slogan should be CNN, the least trusted name in news." And on top of that, he also has been attacking the FBI and the agency itself because they're actually investigating a foreign government infiltrating our election system and basically chipping away at our democracy. So, I mean, look, he is at war and declaring wars and starting wars.
He doesn't care.
He doesn't.
Interesting here. So, two things on this. One, I thought that the pro-law enforcement people voted for Donald Trump because he was so pro-law enforcement, but he spent the past week literally attacking law enforcement. So, the quote-unquote Blue Lives Matter people might want to rethink the whole support for Trump thing.
They don't even think like that.
No, I know, because they're not smart enough to think like that. But then there's the second level of this, which is Donald Trump is great at projecting. Donald Trump is like, I am rubber and you are glue, and anything you say bounces off me and sticks on you. If Donald Trump is guilty of something, he will find a way to say that somebody else, mostly Hillary Clinton, is guilty of the very thing that he is, is guilty of himself, because this is what people who project do. This is like a classic case for psychological, study on how you blame other people for those things that thing that you are guilty for. And on top of which, apparently now they're saying the White House is saying that following Donald Trump slurring his speech the other day, he's going to go for a physical. Is he going to see Dr. Longhair? I might have just taken a bong hit. Yeah. And are they going to check his mental health? Because, the other day he was talking about rocket fuel and, the energy thing. And then he started talking about Rocket Man at Korea when he was at this crazy campaign rally because he apparently thinks that he's still running for president against Hillary Clinton. I'm just so confused about all of these things. Like, what the heck is going on, guys?
I would highly recommend people read. There was a really long article, but really great article in the Times this weekend called "Inside Trump's Hour-by-Hour Battle for Self-Preservation." It was written by Maggie Haberman, Glenn Thrush, who I don't know how he hasn't stepped down yet because he has been accused of sexual assault and harassment, not assault, and Peter Baker, that kind of goes through Trump's mindset and how he operates each day. And apparently he watches Fox and Friends. Not only does he watch it each day, but he DVRs it when he can't watch it in the morning because it's comforting to him. It's like a soothing video. It's like some of us watch puppy videos on YouTube to relax at the end of the day, but he watches Fox and Friends to feel better about himself.
Ego stroke.
When he's not at Fox and Friends, he's at the Winter White House, Mar-a-Lago. Yeah, it's horrible, and I think that the reason why he watches Fox is because that's the only network that will perpetuate all fake news and propaganda that just boosts his esteem and ego, and probably makes him feel really good about himself because he knows how much he's hated.
Goebbels would be so proud.
For real.
Keeping this on theme today.
Yeah, definitely, guys. But on that note, we do have to take another break, but don't go anywhere. We're going to continue the conversations going right here, right now on Let Your Voice Be Heard.
I wanna make love.
And we are back. All right, guys. So, let's take it back. Let's go back to, before all this fun stuff started. No, I'm kidding. So back in 1941, there was a war going on in Europe. Japan was also involved in that war. The United States had not yet gotten involved, at least not explicitly. They were helping out some of the allies, mainly the British and the French, by supplying lots of goods and, lots of military equipment, but they did not have any boots on the ground. Behind the scenes, FDR sort of wanted to get involved in the war, but the American public really was not interested at that point, and they really thought that we should stay out of it. And then there became an attack, and this attack was on Pearl Harbor. And after the attack, FDR went on the radio and he said this was a day that would live in infamy. And he went to Congress and he requested a declaration of war. Yeah, we actually used to do that, but that's another show. And when he requested this declaration of war, Congress granted to it, and we went to war. We joined World War II on the side of the Allies. Now, before really that happened, what really was going on in Europe throughout the 1930s was this rise of nationalism. You saw this in Germany through the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. You saw this going on in Italy through the rise of Mussolini, and in many other places throughout the Western Europe. And that is sort of what was the catalyst for World War II. And so, that thing that was going on in Western Europe sort of has a large role and ties in a lot to some of the things that we are seeing today, in that now we are living in a time where we're seeing rising nationalism, not just here in America, but also in Europe. Like, for example, Brexit. There is largely a lot of anti-Muslim and even some anti-Jewish, sentiment going on in France. Marine Le Pen came the closest to ever winning an election that the far-right party in France has ever come. And so there is a lot of connections that we are currently seeing. As I mentioned earlier in the show during the previous segment, today is the 50th anniversary of the UN's Declaration on Human Rights. And so we thought it would be really interesting to sort of have a conversation where we talk about how some of the historical events in the past tie into some of the oppression that we are now seeing today, because, there's a lot of connections there. And if we do not learn from history, we are bound to repeat it. So it is extremely important that we continue to have these types of conversations and to discuss how the past is connected to the present, and what we can do to learn from the past and to make sure that these things are not perpetuated going forward. So on that note, and with that historical background, I'm going to open it up to the panel, and I'm going to ask you guys, what do you think about some of the things that we're currently seeing going on today, and how they connect back to some of the things going on during the 1940s? Jaqi?
Well, what's interesting to sort of tie it back to the last segment is that we're still, it's not even that we can compare things that happened then in the 1940s to what are happening today as being similar, but we're still dealing with the effect of World War II and certainly the Holocaust when it comes to Israel and the way that Jews are looking at foreign policy, specifically dealing with Israel and Palestine. But, I think that history is incredibly important. I think it's sort of underrated why it's so necessary to learn our history and to learn that, just because we're in 2017 and not in 1937, doesn't mean that we can't err in the same ways. And, history tends to repeat itself, often differently. But, there are a lot of things that we did then that we might do now. And so I think it's important to look back at where we've come from so that we don't make the same mistakes again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's a lot to say there about what happened following World War II and specifically the attack on Pearl Harbor, and how it sort of led to a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. We saw that Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps. And I think that if you look at what's happening today, especially against the Muslim community, there was an attack again on New York City back in 2001, and that led to the rise of anti-Muslim sentiment and a lot of anti-immigration as well. And those people who felt like that, they voted and they won, and now we have a president who's literally enacting this type of rhetoric and putting it into policy, putting it into legislation. We see that with the Muslim ban. We see what's going on in Palestine and Israel. We just talked about that earlier today. But yeah, I think that every time another country attacks U.S. soil, all of a sudden Americans are like, get these people of color out of here, they're terrorists. But it's like, when we examine how many white people, white men, or evangelical Christians who are white as well, how many times that they attack and they attack people right in their own cities or homes or like churches or people of color. We never really look at that as something that's more than an isolated incident. And I think that it's terrible and it's disheartening that we continue to make these mistakes.
No,
Ilyssa?
I think that's a great point. I was reading an article the other day, and it said that basically 99.9% of terrorist attacks are being perpetuated by men. And so then the question becomes, okay, well, do we ban men, right? You know,
Yes.
like that was obviously
Yes.
a rhetorical question. But it just goes to show you, yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up the internment camps, because it was something that I wanted to talk about, which is, you know, like liberals, they hold FDR up as this great progressive. And in terms of economics, he really was. You know, he had the New Deal and it was great. But at the same time, FDR was likely an anti-Semite. He was very much somebody who wanted to get involved in a war and, you know, believed in the military-industrial complex. And the biggest stain on his legacy is the internment camps. And the internment camps is so connected to what you were talking about, Selena, in terms of the Muslim ban, because we are literally like one step away from that. And it's based on largely the same thing, which is, you know, Japanese citizens attacked Pearl Harbor, which is sort of how I started this segment. And thereafter, America got scared and literally put...
It wasn't Japanese citizens.
Who attacked Pearl Harbor?
Oh, Japanese citizen. I thought you meant like Japanese
right.
American
no,
citizens.
Japanese,
Sorry.
Yeah, no. So
Yeah, right. Got
Japanese citizens attacked Pearl
yeah.
Harbor, and then the U.S. government interned Japanese Americans into camps for pretty much the duration of the war. And so I think it's really important that we have this conversation, because it's like we are living at a time where, in theory, Donald Trump could turn around and start interring, or try to at least intern Muslim Americans.
And can you talk about legally why that's not so? Because it sounds like at face value sort of outrageous. Like, no, like you can't do that in 2017. You can't just put people into camps in the United States. Can you talk about legally why that can potentially happen and why we are really one step away from that happening?
Right. So, okay, the decision that Jacki's really alluding to is a decision called Korematsu versus the United States. When the Japanese people were interned, there was a lawsuit brought by a guy named Fred Korematsu, and he argued that the internment camps violated his civil rights. They violated due process under the law, and that they violated a whole host of other, provisions of the Constitution. The Supreme Court actually disagreed. What the Supreme Court said in the Korematsu decision, which is looked upon as like literally the worst Supreme Court decision since Dred Scott that has ever come out. And they agreed, and they said that basically because America was in war and this was a very different kind of time, that essentially the president had the right to take actions that he wouldn't otherwise being able to take. But to take that one step further and go back to Jacki's point, that decision was never explicitly overturned. And the way the court essentially works is the court has precedents, and then later on down the road, if the court no longer agrees with that precedent, they explicitly overturn that. A good example of that is in 1986 in Bowers versus Hardwick, the court ruled that sodomy was illegal and that gay people could be prosecuted for sodomy. In 2003, the court overturned that decision explicitly in the Lawrence decision when they ruled that they were wrong and that they had gotten it wrong in Bowers. The Korematsu decision has never explicitly been overturned. And even though the courts have said it's a horrible decision and that, they don't consider it to have any weight, the fact of the matter is it's still on the books. And so at any time, the president really could just decide to start rounding up Muslims or rounding up any group of people and interring them and linking that to the war on terrorism. And say that he can do that. And then the Supreme Court, it would be up to the Supreme Court to either explicitly overrule Korematsu at that time or to say, you know what, we're going to let Korematsu not to stand. Yeah, this is perfectly acceptable under the Constitution. And that's a really scary thought. But I think like we have to back up and talk about for a second like where this is all coming from. And that's really like the nationalist thing, because what was going on in 1930s Germany is very, very similar to what was going on here, in that people felt an economic strain. Hitler said he was going to make Germany great again for all intents and purposes. He blamed the Jews, just like Donald Trump is like blaming Muslims and immigrants. Like it literally, I don't want to call Donald Trump Hitler because he's not Hitler, or at least not yet. But then again, like Hitler wasn't Hitler until Hitler was Hitler, right? Mm-hmm. So like, that is why I think this is such an important conversation, because some of the economic things that we're seeing here is, and Stanley and I have had this conversation before, white people felt economically disadvantaged. And that is part of the reason, along with racism, why they voted for Donald Trump.
No, you're absolutely right. And guys, if you're listening and you want to chime in, again, the number is 212-650-6903. No, I just wanted to chime in because I actually heard a report where it said that studies showed that when citizens or individuals, particularly white people, feel at an economic disadvantage or they feel economically threatened, they tend to group together and they tend to use this fear to ostracize the other. And as Ilyssa points out, the other back then were Japanese folks, right? Or even Jews, or even people who were like from Ireland at one point in this country. And now that other happens to be brown people from Arabic countries and from Central America and other Hispanic speaking countries. So again, it's history. It's repeating itself, and it all stems down to white supremacy, because at the heart of it, it's like if white people feel like their privilege is being threatened in any type of way, they have gone to the extent to kill, steal, and destroy anyone or thing that threatens their superiority. And I just want to point out, because it is really deep, people of color, particularly black people, aren't trying to ask for we're not trying to ask to like overtake them. We're fighting for equality. Right. Equality threatens white supremacy so much to the point where they're like, we're going to use the law and elect people into a different congressional seats and even our White House that are going to uphold legislation, rhetoric, and policies that will keep these people out.
Right. And I mean, I think somewhere deep down, these white supremacists fear that they'll be treated by people of color the way that they've treated people of color. And they know how bad that is. And so they'll do anything to keep that from happening.
Well, yeah, I mean, listen, that plays right into the Roy Moore thing, which is people are going to vote for Roy Moore despite the allegations against him because he is a vehement white supremacist. Yeah. He wants to go to Congress and uphold white supremacist values. I actually, just as a funny aside, I saw people talking the other day about if we want to make America great again, that we should make Roy Moore a slave, which sort of plays into that thing that you said, that like white people are afraid that if they're no longer in the majority, that they're going to be oppressed.
I don't. You know what? I don't even think it goes that far. I think that they just don't even want to compete on equal footing. That's what I'm saying. It's not even about oppression. They just do not want to lose their supremacy. Jaqi?
Yeah, no, I definitely think you're right. And it's sad because when you look at like the disparity of wealth in this country and you look at, working class white people, they have a lot more in common with everybody else than they do with Donald Trump, right? But they want to uphold Donald Trump and, these sort of like rich white people who do not care about them, right? And they're, are happy and willing to exploit their work and their rights to gain more power and more influence and more money because they don't want to be considered in the same category, the same boat as everybody else. And so they're willing to do and say and vote for whomever to have this perception of being in control and, being powerful.
Absolutely. And, Ilyssa gave an excellent historical analysis of the rise of white nationalism following the attack on Pearl Harbor and how that compares to today. But let's talk about some of the differences, because back then, folks didn't have social media and
they weren't live tweeting the attacks on Pearl Harbor.
Absolutely. And they did not have access at a click of a button to send out information that can can hit every spot, every corner of the world.
Or misinformation.
Right. And so let's talk about that, because, I mean, I know history repeats itself, but do you think that we're living in a time that's even worse because of social media and access to information?
I think that's hard to say. I think it's good and it's bad, right? Because social media social media, it's both. It's good and it's bad, right? There have been negative things perpetuated, and certainly a lot of people blame a lot. And Russia interfered with like Facebook and, bought ads, and there was a lot of fake news that was spread throughout Facebook. But social media has served a really valuable purpose as well, to be able to mobilize people and organize. And it's shed a light on parts of the world that, we as Americans may not have access to. It was one of the key. Twitter was crucial for the Arab Spring, right? To find out what was going on. And, so it has provided a lot of transparency into places and sunlight into things that we may not have had access to otherwise. But on the flip side, it's put forth a lot of false ideas and narratives, and has been a platform to elevate these incorrect notions about society, and, articles that are fake. We saw a lot of fake news being spread throughout Facebook, that everybody fell for.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I agree with you. I think it's sort of like a blessing and a curse. Like, on one level, people now have access to, like, information at the tip of their fingers. But at the same time that they have access to the correct information, they also have access to a lot of incorrect and misinformation. Right. And so, you're at a time where literally if you want to know something or learn something, honestly, you can just jump on your phone and find out. But you can also jump on your phone and end up in a bubble where you're only hearing a feedback loop of the things that you want to hear. At the same time that social media has helped to connect oppressed peoples to band together, it has also helped to connect the racists and people who have unsavory motives, and let them band together again in their own echo chamber. So, and at the other thing, it sort of amplified the conversation in some ways to make it seem like things are really like crazy more intense than they are sometimes, and that in turn ends up leading things to become more intense, when sometimes we all just need to chill out. But on that note, we're going to take a quick chill out, and then we're going to come right back and continue having this conversation.
This is Let Your Voice Be Heard
on WHCR.
I'd rather be crazy. Hold up, they don't love you like I love you. Slow down, they don't love you like I love you. Back up.
I think Donald Trump needs to hold up. We are right back on Let Your Voice Be Heard right here on WHCR 90.3 FM. My name is Selena Hill. I'm here with my co-hosts Ilyssa Fuchs and Jaqi Cohen. Stanley Fritz is somewhere in the abyss watching us via Facebook Live.
Hey, Stanley.
What's up, Stanley? So we, before we went on break, we were talking about Pearl Harbor, 76 years later, and how that led to an uprising of white nationalism, sort of how what's happening today, and everything that sort of played out following the attacks on the Twin Towers here in New York City on September 11th. So I just wanted to bring the conversation back where we left off. We were talking about social media and how having access to information has helped white nationalists band together. But on the flip side, it's also helped the good people like you and I get positive information, educate and inform, and make sure that we are staying on top of this evil so that we can combat it. And speaking of that, I want to talk about how people resisted back in the 40s when, the Japanese Americans were being put into internment camps, and a lot of people looked at them as the other. There were still, and even like around the world when anti-Semitism was at its high, there were still some good people who were resisting and pushing back. I'll throw it to you, Ilyssa.
Right. So, I mean, one of the things that people who were not Jewish in Germany did was they helped to help Jewish people escape from Germany. So basically there was like almost like an underground railroad sort of situation set up. And there was one gentleman in particular whose name, of course, is escaping me. Jaqi, I don't know if you happen to know it off the top of your head, but who was like directly responsible for helping over 200 or 300 Jews escape from Germany and transporting them.
Oscar Schindler that you're talking.
No. There was somebody else, but there was many people like that. So that was one of the things that was being done there. Obviously, that's a very extreme type of action because right now we are not, thankfully, in the situation where people are being sent to death camps. But at the same time, I do think that there's still a lot of things that we can do in terms, some of which we are already doing. Protesting, speaking out against these types of injustices, putting pressure on our elected officials, to fight against these. Like from a legal perspective, there's a lot of lawyers that have been filing amicus briefs, which are friend of the court briefs, to help people out, to help the courts out in looking at these issues and to support certain sides of them. So there's numerous different actions that we can take to resist this kind of nationalistic fervor and to, protect oppressed and people from this kind of thing happening again. Jaqi?
And I mean, to bring it back to Pearl Harbor and the way that people resisted in the United States, like look at Fred Korematsu, right? Look at his use of the courts. He sued because he felt, and correctly, even though the case didn't turn out the way that he wanted or probably should have. But he used the courts to sort of resist what the American government was doing. And, we're still using, like Ilyssa said, people are still filing amicus briefs. They are resisting things like the Muslim ban, which I think has the closest tie here to this conversation, through the judicial system. So, there are ways that we can leverage power and, using one full branch of government is one of them.
Definitely. And I'm so glad that you brought up those examples here because I think that there's a lot of lessons from the past that should and could be applied today. It seems like history is just repeating itself and the majority has a lot of power to ostracize the other and to even keep them out of the country legally. And then you have this whole movement to build a wall on the southern border to keep more refugees out and people just looking for a better life. So, when it comes to looking back and applying that today, what lessons would you tell our government or those in the resistance to advocate behind?
I think to not become complacent, one of the words of 2016 maybe was, normalizing, and don't normalize this behavior. Because as soon as we become complacent, the government can take over and do whatever it wants. And, Trump can take over and continue to bar people from entering this country and make life very, very difficult for the people in this country that he doesn't think should be here. And so I think it's important for people to leverage their voices, leverage whatever privilege they have, because obviously to go to court to put your body on the line has different repercussions for some people than others. And so we should be speaking out. Like Ilyssa said, there were plenty of people in Nazi Germany who were, putting their lives at risk to save Jews and to hide them and to get them out of the country. And so we as people, if we are not being actively oppressed, we need to use our privilege to help those that are.
Right. No, I absolutely agree with everything that you guys just said. I don't want to repeat it. Another thing is get involved. Yes, you can go march in the streets, and you can go do these things, and that's being involved. Yes, but I mean also get involved at a deeper level, whether it's supporting candidates that through money, which we've talked about, if you can afford to do so, or even volunteering your time. I'll give you a great example of something that you can do right now, which is we have a real opportunity to win a Senate seat in Alabama, of all places, and to beat somebody who is a nationalist racist who agrees with Donald Trump and who's going to support him in everything. There is ways for you to do get out the vote phone banking right now from New York, from your house. You don't even have to go anywhere. So I saw numerous, there's also, there's information. I don't know exactly the information on where you go to do that. But I know that I saw people talking about it. If you go online and Google phone banking for Doug Jones, there are at least one or two locations that are set up here in New York City where you can go phone bank for Doug Jones. And I know that there's ways for you to do it from your house. So there are legitimately ways for you to get involved and to help, and the other thing is, talk to your family members, have uncomfortable conversations. People always say, oh, we don't want to have that kind of conversation at the dinner table, during Christmas, during Thanksgiving. You know, you might not want to have that conversation, but that's almost the best time to have that conversation with the people in your family because they're a captive audience. They cannot go anywhere.
And they're probably not hanging out with you any other time.
So, you know, like,
who wants to hang out with them?
I'm sorry, but like, confront your family with these harsh realities, especially if you have that uncle in your family who says things that are borderline racist. Like, you know, because at the end of the day, this goes back to what I was saying in the last segment. When people don't speak up, when people don't do anything, this is when atrocities happen. This is when genocides happen. This is when people start getting literally sent to camps on trains and people in the community see it and they don't say anything about it. We do not want it to get to that point, and there's no reason it should ever get to that level. But if you do not speak out and say anything, then you are complicit in that kind of action.
Yeah. What did Dr. King say about the white moderate being like the biggest threat to society? Like there's something so true about, you know, you can think the way that you think and you can have your progressive ideals. And if you keep that to yourself and you allow people in your life to perpetuate false narratives and hate and bigotry and you don't do anything about it, you are a part of the problem. And I want to really echo what Ilyssa said, that it's uncomfortable to have these conversations, and that's okay. These are uncomfortable topics, right? But it is your responsibility. If you know, it's not enough anymore to just simply go out and vote or just believe that these things are true. You need to have these uncomfortable conversations. You need to talk to your family, to your friends, because they're not going to turn on CNN and believe strangers that they have no investment in. They'll be more willing to listen to you. And take it from me as somebody that knows personally, it can be difficult to have these conversations one-on-one. They don't go super easily. You know, you might not make a lot of progress in the first 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 conversations, but progress can be made. You need to hold the people in your life accountable. You shouldn't expect others to do it if you cannot.
Yeah, final comment, Ilyssa?
I mean, listen, I was just going to say, Martin Luther King once said, on top of the quote you already gave, freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Mm-hmm. We're only going to see a situation where oppressed people continue to rise up and demand this freedom. And it would be much better for that to happen in a nonviolent way than in a violent way. But, you know, that's the reason why keeping these conversations going is so important, because ultimately, if we don't continue to have this conversation, then we are going to see violence, and that is not something that we want.
You know, Jaqi, you made a great point about getting in uncomfortable spaces with family members that have uncomfortable conversations. You want to know what's even more uncomfortable than that topic? Death. The people who are dying.
Absolutely.
And the people who are literally being kicked out and oppressed because of fear and ignorance. And the only way to combat it is to have those conversations and to inform, to educate, and empower, which is what we do every week here on Let Your Voice Be Heard. I actually wanted to end this conversation by saying this. It was a clear, sunny morning 76 years ago when Japan killed 2,403 Americans on December 7th, 1941. Following that attack, more than 400,000 U.S. soldiers died in the next 4 years. But in turn for their lives, they fought against fascism, they fought against racism, and they fought against these isms that were taking over the world in Europe and Asia, and they fought for those who were oppressed. Unfortunately, it took us dying and it took an attack directly on U.S. soil for the U.S. to stand up against fascism and against oppression. That's what it took for us to wake up. My question to you is, what will it take you to wake up? Do more people have to die? Do we have to continue to watch Syrian refugees die in waters and little boys wash up on beaches because we won't let these oppressed people into our country because they can't find asylum here? It shouldn't take death, but it looks like the only time we as privileged Americans, especially to my white privileged Americans, start to care about stuff is when it hits our soil. And it shouldn't take that. We should learn from the lessons of yesterday and apply them to today and tomorrow. Because if we don't, then guess who's going to be knocking on our door? Death. And on that note, I am going to wrap up this conversation, guys. We're going to go on a quick break, but don't go anywhere. We're coming right back to the Quickie on Let Your Voice Be Heard.
Inside the concrete, I pray it forever.
Freedom, freedom, I can't move. Freedom, cut me loose. Freedom, freedom, where are you? 'Cause I need freedom too. I break chains all by myself.
And we are back. So imagine for a second, and I was going to pose this to both you and Jaqi, but unfortunately Jaqi had to run. So Selena, imagine for a second that you work in a public sector job, right? You have a government job, but for some reason you don't want to be in the union. And even though you don't join the union, you are now told that you are still going to have to pay a small fee because even though you aren't in the union, you are still going to benefit from what the union is doing. How would you feel about having to pay a small fee because you were getting some kind of benefit even though you were the member of the union?
Sounds like a fair deal.
Right. Well, some people don't think that is very fair. And one of the people who does not think it's very fair that he should have to pay a small fee, even though he's not in the union, is a guy named Mark Janis. And Mark Janis is an Illinois government employee. And he believes that having to pay this fee is amounting to compelled speech that requires him to subsidize the political views that he does not support in violation of his First Amendment rights. And he says that because unions play a powerful civic voice and a political role when they strike collective bargaining agreements, he considers that work to be inseparable from the union's other political and ideological activities. And so what did he do? He brought a lawsuit. And he argued that having to pay that, what we call an agency fee, violates his First Amendment rights. Now, this case wound its way through the courts, and eventually it is going to make its way to the United States Supreme Court, who announced a couple of weeks ago that they are going to hear the case. The name of the case is Janis versus the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, Council 31, which is the union. And the Supreme Court's ruling, which likely probably will not come until the end of June, will potentially be dealing a devastating blow to public sector unions, depending on how the Supreme Court comes out. Now, this is not the first time the Supreme Court is hearing a union challenge like this. This is actually the third time that they are hearing a very similar case. The last time they heard a case like this was the case that I mentioned earlier, Frederick versus California. That case, the arguments were almost exactly identical to the arguments we're hearing today. I actually did a previous Quickie on that case, so if you're interested, you can go back through our archives and look for, Frederick, that's Fredrich versus California, and you will find that Quickie. And you can actually compare that Quickie that I did then to this Quickie. You'll find that these cases are very, very similar. But in that case, Frederick, the court did not reach a decision. And the reason why they did not reach a decision is because after they heard arguments in the case, but before they issued a decision, Justice Scalia died. And then the justices became deadlocked, and they ended up being so deadlocked that they realized they were never going to be able to issue a majority decision. And if they issue a decision that's 4-4, that doesn't hold any legal weight because they're tied. And so they said, well, I guess we're going to have to take a new case and sort of get a redo. Well, guess who's now sitting on the court for the redo? Justice Gorsuch, or Gorsucki, as I like to call him here. And Justice Scalia's death and the vacancy essentially placed the future of public sector unions in the hands of the 2016 election. And Justice Neil Gorsuch, who joined the court in April after his nomination by President Trump, he did not share his views about organized labor during his confirmation hearings, but his track record as a judge in the 10th Circuit was to strongly favor businesses over labor and strongly dislike unions. This decision is probably going to be the first tangible and significant impact of the 2016 presidential election, because this is directly connected to the fact that Republicans won this election and were able to put Gorsuch in this seat. And so, that's why it was so important, and not to divert, because I've sort of talked about this before. One of the things that happened during the 2016 election that was so crucial was the this seat being the reason why Republicans said they went out and voted for Donald Trump. So that is something that we should also keep in mind. But, why is this case so directly important? The case centers on public sector unions' ability to collect what are known as agency fees. They're sometimes called fair share fees, and it works like I explained during my example to Selena, which is in order to fund the operations, unions rely on dues and other contributions from their members. But they can also collect this small fee from non-members who are benefiting from their work doing collective bargaining, because even though these people are not part of the union, they still get some benefits from the union's work. For example, higher wages or better working conditions. There are 23 states that allow public sector unions to collect these agencies fees. And in 1977, in a case called Abood versus Detroit Board of Education, the Supreme Court upheld this system. Under Abood, unions can collect the fees without directly violating the Constitution, so long as they only use the revenue to cover costs directly related to their collective bargaining work. At the same time, the court said that the money cannot be used to pay for a union's political or ideological activities. Janus, the guy who is suing, Mark Janus, as I mentioned, he wants to change that. He believes that these two things are inseparable, that the collective bargaining work is inseparable from the union's political or ideological activities, and therefore he is being compelled to give speech that he doesn't want to give by having to pay this fee. Organized labor groups strongly disagree with this interpretation. They oppose the court's efforts to reconsider the Abood decision. Unions use the term fair share payments because they argue that the fees prevent non-union members from free riding and getting a benefit that they didn't pay for, and that it solves the free rider problem. Now, what can we expect? Well, the court's conservative members, led by Justice Samuel Alito, have signaled that they are uncomfortable with the Abood decision in recent years. In 2012, in another case known as Knox versus Service Employees, Justice Alito called the 1977 precedent something of an anomaly for its First Amendment implications. 2 years later, in another union case, which is called Harris versus Quinn, Justice Alito questioned the Abood decision and the reasoning at length before concluding that it was questionable on several different grounds. And the 5-justice majority in Harris effectively telegraphed that they are willing to overturn this Abood decision. And now, as I said, they have their 5th member through Justice Gorsuch. Merrick Garland, he might not have voted for this. Somebody that Hillary Clinton would have appointed to this court seat, had she have won, almost definitely would not have voted for this. Elections have consequences, but I digress. What happens if Janus wins? What is that consequence going to be? Well, if Janus prevails and Abood is overturned, the court's ruling could effectively act as a nationwide right-to-work law for the country's public sector unions, with potentially crushing implications for the funding and the resources of the unions that represent them. This is because it was estimated in 2015 that only about a third of the workers that public unions represent would pay fees no matter what. About half of those people were on the fence about it. In other words, if given the option to leave the union and avoid paying a fee, many would take that option, and they would still be getting a benefit from the union's collective bargaining efforts nonetheless. That would not only affect the union's financial health, but would possibly have broader implications for politics more broadly. Although the fees issue is now in front of the court, and the unions cannot use these fees for politics and lobbying, this also could lead to a reduced role of organized labor in the political stage. Just as an aside, by one estimate, during the 2012 election cycle, organized labor spent $1.7 billion supporting Democratic candidates. I will end by saying this. The stakes in this case are very high, not only for the parties, but also for other unions and, that represent public employees who have to pay agencies fees and the health of the unions. Unions brought us the 5-day work week. Unions brought us the weekends. Unions brought us laws that say that, you have to work in conditions that are safe for your health. Unions have had incredible benefit on this country, and it would be a shame, an absolute shame, if they were to go away because of this decision. And the last thing I will say, which I already said, but I'm going to reiterate because it is super important, elections have consequences. Your local elections have consequences. The midterm elections have consequences. The presidential election has consequences. Go out and vote. Even if it's for somebody that you may not agree with on everything. You are never going to find your unicorn candidate that you are going to agree with on everything. It is important that you go out and support candidates that you at least agree with, 60, 70%. I can't stand Ronald Reagan, but he once said, I'll take 70% of what I can get and I'll try and come back and get the other 30% later on. Liberals, take 70% of what you can get and go out and vote. The midterms are coming. Let's have a blue wave.
Thank you, Ilyssa, for breaking down this SCOTUS case, which will decide the fate of unions, something that even Donald Trump constituents and supporters will greatly miss because they benefit from. But hey, they voted for this. On that note, guys, I just want to take some time to thank everyone who listened in and chimed in. I see all the comments flooding our stream.
No,
on
we're
Facebook
being
Live.
trolled, and we will let you comment if you have something legitimate to say, even if you disagree with us. But we are blocking the trolls today.
All right. And on that note, we want to thank everyone else who listened in. And guys, if you want to continue to support Let Your Voice Be Heard and listen to us, we have a podcast that you can find on iTunes, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Google, and of course, SoundCloud. You can also check us out online at lyvbh.com. And of course, you can check us out on all of our social media platforms, Facebook, Let Your Voice Be Heard, and Instagram and Twitter at BeHeard_radio. On that note, guys, continue to fight the power as we will continue to inform, educate, and empower. It's been real. We thank you, and God bless.